Come on into the ditch. I'm your resident ditch witch, Tara Tyne, and we're about to get witchy, whether you like it or not. Today, I am honoured to be joined by Amy O'Riordan of Craft Cailleach YouTube channel. Link in the description. Amy has a great channel covering many aspects of Irish history, culture, and craft, and is currently doing an MA in Regional Irish History in Carlow College, where she has been learning all about an area of Irish history that we haven't gone too far into on this channel yet, and that is the Irish famine / genocide. But a big Vulture to you, Amy. Welcome, welcome. I'm delighted we finally have a chance to chat.
Delighted to be here. Thank you very much for having me, Tara.
It's been a while coming. I've been admiring your channel. You've some really excellent videos up there, really informative things, and I'm always learning stuff off you as well. That like you had one about Irish women revolutionaries there, and like it's a tough thing to have to go and to start digging from scratch to find out about it. But you have really concise content, a great way of explaining things to people. So check her out if you haven't been on Amy's channel yet. Excellent stuff. Crafty Cailleach. So
I'm blushing here.
the making witches blush. So it's a bit of an unfestive topic, or it might seem that way to people, to be having this kind of conversation about the famine / genocide in Ireland and all of the issues that sprung out from that, like eviction, homelessness, and all of the kind of social consequences. And it's very Christmassy in here, and it's a bit of a juxtaposition, but there are actually huge parallels with this really difficult aspect of our history and what's actually happening in Ireland today. We have an unprecedented number of people and families in Ireland who are worried about being or becoming homeless this winter. It's not just a small subsect of society anymore. People are becoming homeless en masse due to ridiculous laws and ever-rising rent caps and unaffordable housing prices, and basically just capitalism. It's eerily similar to something which has happened in our not too distant past. For those who aren't familiar with this aspect of Irish history, 1847, otherwise known as Black 47, was the darkest year of the Irish famine / genocide, when evictions were at an all-time high. 1 million were dying and 1 million were fleeing, or so they say. 1 million dead, 1 million fled. And after that, things usually devolve into whispered tones. It gets a bit difficult to talk about it beyond that, because it's still kind of very recent in our history too. So today we're hoping to shed some light on this, and we're going to ask some questions. And I will admit that I had some help on these now from both Dave and my friend Marcus at the Easter Rising Stories YouTube channel, which is, as you've heard me say before, an invaluable archive of documentary footage about Ireland's revolutionary periods. He's a huge fan of your channel, Amy.
Oh, really?
Yes, he's a huge fan. And yeah, he, unlike me, is able to read books about the famine without it completely ruining his week. And thank God that somebody can. So the three of us put our heads together last night, and we put these questions down for you, Amy. Can you tell us, first of all, for a wee bit of context for people maybe that aren't from Ireland, especially, can we talk about how far back the Irish grow, some might call it an obsession, for land ownership actually goes in this country?
So this could derail the entire conversation, but I'll try to keep it concise. So I suppose we can go back to the Normans, the first kind of very big invasion, because while the Vikings did invade, they didn't really amass a lot of land, and they didn't take over a lot of land. Waterford is kind of an exception to that, but really when you see the Normans come over, and as we were saying just before we started recording there, there was a little bit of an invitation for that to happen. But when they came over, you really start to see land being taken and given to Anglo-Normans. And you kind of start to see that kind of divide of land. But if you even look at Lauragabal Air and like the Book of Invasions, we just constantly have people coming over trying to take over the land.
Yeah.
So it's kind of it's kind of most of what our history is made up of. But I think really when you start to look at kind of later periods in history, like the penal laws in 1695, you start to properly see property ownership. The landlord situation start to develop, the tensions around that, the prohibition on Catholics, Catholic Irish, the majority of people that were Irish were Catholic, but there was a prohibition on Catholics owning land. And then by the early 1700s, you have 90% of the population being Irish Catholic, owning just 10% of the land. And then there was, then in the early 1700s as well, you have that subdivision of land that we would have heard about in primary school history and secondary school history, where that, like, you're not just giving your land and your property, it wouldn't be inherited just by the oldest son, it would be split up between all the sons. So that subdivided the land. So a bigger holding over time and over generations would have become very, very small. And the income on that would have also deteriorated. And then when you come into the 19th century and you get to pre-famine and post-famine, you really see the tensions come to a head with landlords and tenants and the holding of land. And then, as you were saying there, like evictions coming into play, mass emigration. There was then the rent boycotts that came in, the land wars, tenant revolts, landlord assassinations. Like, there's so much going on then in the 19th century, where I think, in my opinion anyway, when you kind of look back 200 years before that to the penal laws and how that all played out over 200 years, and then really coming to a head then in the 19th century, and then that leads then into the revolution in the 20th century. So there's a lot. There's a lot of Irish history.
So when we've made it up as far as, you know, round about the mid 19th century, we reach what people usually outside of Ireland will refer to as the famine, and what you'll hear a lot of Irish people refer to as genocide. And sometimes the terms are used interchangeably. Can you explain for us, for people that aren't sure, why, Amy, why this is?
So I'm a little bit on the fence about using genocide. I like with my historian hat on, I'm definitely on the fence with it. With my kind of more national, personal side, I'm kind of more, kind of leaning towards a yes on it. But essentially, when it comes to the famine, and it comes to essentially during the 19th century, from the Act of Union in I think 1801, I need to double check the year on that, but I think 1801, the Act of Union came in, which officially made Ireland part of the United Kingdom. When that came in, they were essentially, the British Parliament and the Kingdom of Britain were in charge of relief for Ireland before the famine in the 1840s. There were other famines prior to it, but they just weren't as devastating, I suppose. But when you come to like in the 1830s, you have the poor law unions coming into effect, where unions would have been set up around the country to essentially provide relief to the destitute and to peasants who maybe didn't have as much of an income. And then when the famine hit, that was really heavily relied on. Then you had a lot of workhouses that were popping up under these poor law unions. And essentially, when you get to, I think it's 1847, in the autumn of 1847, the British government essentially announced, oh, the famine is over, we're stopping relief. And while there was still relief given, I think that's where a lot of the kind of genocide labeling would come in, because it does, from one side, there is an argument there to say they didn't do enough, they could have done more. There was definitely advantage taken from British Parliament and landlords themselves. There was definitely advantage taken of the situation in order to get tenants off land, to evict tenants, to assist people in emigration, which does really, when I'm reading, like, it's really hard for me to not read that as forced emigration, because
coffin ships is the first
yeah,
thing that springs to mind for me.
exactly. And like what you had happening was, instead of landlords using funds and using resources to help their tenants, they decided, right, well, we'll take the resources, we'll take the money, we'll pay for a ship, we'll put them all on a ship and we'll ship them off to North America. And you're giving tenants essentially, and like, even if you thought about it yourself, like if you were given the option to be homeless with no money and no support and go to a workhouse, which the conditions weren't great, they were packed to the rafters as well, or get on a ship and be promised this new life where there's work across the sea, the American dream is being kind of sold to you. Which one are you going to take? So there was an uptake of emigration, but the options weren't really great.
The Act of Union that put Britain in charge of all of these, essentially every aspect of Irish law, Irish society, food in the Irish belly. Had we voted for that at that Act of Union?
I actually don't know the full ins and outs of the Act of Union coming into play. I haven't gotten that deep into it yet. I'm kind of more looking at the poor law unions and the emigration side of it. But it would have been British Parliament voting it in, mostly. And
so
then
basically, just to illustrate for people that the Irish didn't really get a say in that's what we mean when we talk about colonization and oppression and all of those things. It was essentially just people coming in from another country and just deciding, right, this is how it is. And at a time when there was potato blight, people make the mistake of thinking we didn't have cabbages and carrots and all of them things. We did, but they were taken away often at gunpoint.
Yeah, they were the vast majority of food that could have prevented starvation was exported. So that's really why famine and the famine, even though there was more than one, why it's really kind of interchanged with genocide. Now, one thing that's, I suppose, important to note, and one thing that I've noticed and I've seen in criticisms of using genocide to describe the famine is there is a real push in Irish American kind of a lot of Irish American rhetoric that would be used about the Irish famine was a genocide, which is kind of one thing, but then sometimes it goes down this slippery slope to it's the equivalent of the Irish Holocaust, and that to me is like a really big no-no, because it's not really comparable. There's a guy, Tim Pat Coogan, who's a real promoter of the famine as a genocide kind of rhetoric, and his work has been highly criticized by historians, that he doesn't really give a full scope. He kind of almost cherry picks what he wants to show, rather than giving a full nuanced scope of exactly what was going on and all the conditions. So there is criticisms of that. There's a really good article by Dr. Liam Kennedy. I'll send it on to you if you want to read it, maybe include it in the notes. He's a historian in UCD, or he was in UCD, and he wrote a very good article comparing the famine, the kind of the effects of the famine, but also how it kind of came about and what the British did and what they didn't do and what was going on kind of internally in Ireland. And then he also looked at a couple of other genocides that were, like, he looked at the Holocaust, and he also looked at another genocide in Eastern Europe. I can't remember which one now, but he kind of looked at it, and basically he came to the conclusion that the intent wasn't necessarily there to be able to label it a genocide, but you can't, I don't think you can also say that the intent wasn't there to get the Irish out of Ireland, because it definitely was. But yeah, so it's a complicated question, I suppose.
There's so much to it, and I mean, even as a person living in Ireland your whole life, you know, you could spend several lifetimes and still know basically nothing about what actually happened during these times.
100%.
Would you be able to summarize it? Is there a particular story, or, you know, could you give us an image of how it would have been for your average Irish person on the ground, say your average Irish Catholic probably in particular, but, you know, what were the challenges people were facing those days and that kind of thing?
So your kind of typical Irish cottier would have been renting a small plot of land, maybe a small portion of land to have their own crops on. They would have been working on a bigger estate, either working on a farm. So how it can be divided up is you can have a very big estate, so like your big house estates, which have acres and acres of land. And then you can have, I suppose, smaller lords or well-off people that might not have a title, but they might have, say, 25% of that land, and then they're subletting. And it's all this kind of subdivision and subletting that's going on. But your typical like Irish peasant would have had a small plot of land with a small section to grow their own food, heavily reliant on the potato, because of the subdivision of land, crop rotation wasn't really able to be done.
Yeah.
So then when the blight hit and they had no income really to supplement, and they had no income to pay their rent, they were mostly given the choice of either you're evicted, go to the workhouse, or go on a ship and emigrate. Now, there were people emigrating prior to the famine because the economics at the time weren't really great. The economic climate wasn't really great. There had been previous famines on smaller scales. So there was emigration starting prior to the Great Hunger, or the An Gorta Mór, but at the same time, it wouldn't have been anywhere near the scale of during and in the years preceding, like into the later half of the 19th century. In the workhouses, I don't know, Tara, did you ever read Under the Hawthorn Tree, the trilogy?
I actually didn't. I don't know how I managed to avoid it, but no, I haven't read it.
You're so lucky. That was like reading that at 8 to 10 was like, that was traumatizing, but it really gave you a picture of, for anyone who hasn't read it, I'm pretty sure it's a trilogy of books by Marita Conlon-McKenna, or I think that's her name, and it's about these 3 or 4 famine orphans basically fending for themselves after their parents die, and they kind of bounce from workhouse to workhouse. They come across, I think I vaguely remember them coming across a very nice daughter of a landlord who gave them apples, or they went and they stole apples from a tree or something on an estate. And it's just really grim, but it really gives you a picture of what that was like and what life was like. So yeah, life would have been pretty bleak. There was also then, at the time, there would have been this thing called Malthusian theory. This guy called Thomas Malthus in the 18th century, so in the 1700s, had this theory, and it's kind of like eco-fascism, and you still see it to this day with the British monarchy, which I'll talk about in a second. But he was basically this economist in the 18th century who talked about food production and that basically it was unsustainable. And this theory started to really be applied in British rhetoric to Ireland. So this is unsustainable. They're having, like, there's overpopulation. There's not enough food, even though there was. And essentially it would result in disease, famine, war, and this kind of rhetoric was going around. So this was a theory that was really, there was a lot of credence given to this theory. So when the famine then happened, there was this kind of like, oh, well, this was bound to happen and we're not really going to help all that much. And then where you see, like, you recently, very recently, a few weeks ago, Prince William, I have an article I'll share with you, but Prince William made very similar comments about Africa recently. And so you can still, again, like we were saying about echoes from, like, this is, you're talking 170 years ago to today, and this stuff is still, it's still going
happening.
on. Yeah.
Well, that's I mean, that's one of the things, like, it's other countries had famine, but Ireland got a really bad go of it, you know. So I suppose the old colonialism would have an awful lot to do with that.
Yeah.
And the colonial attitude, the beliefs, like you were saying there, the prejudice, the belief before they even come in, probably even some of, let's say, the more well-wishing, you know, Anglo-Irish landowners and things like that. You know, you do occasionally hear tales of some of them that weren't all that bad, but even they probably would have been prone to kind of going, the poor Irish, or it was bound to happen to them eventually, you know, like it's destined to happen to us. Well, you're in charge. If it's destined to happen, sure, bloody stop it. Do your best to stop, you know, like.
Yeah. No, but totally. And like even like if you think today, like the way media and the way reports in media and newspapers would influence like how people think and how people talk about things, the same was true. Like they still had newspapers. And you read some of the newspapers that were like British parliamentary newspapers, which or like British kind of aligned newspapers. That's what predominantly the kind of higher classes or the more wealthy classes in Ireland would have been reading. They wouldn't have been reading nationalist newspapers, really.
Yeah.
You know, and then obviously it depends then on who owns the newspaper and who's producing it, and all that bias as well.
And that's probably a whole conversation in and of itself as
well. 100%. 100%. So yeah.
I suppose that leads a lot into I mean, newspapers, as you say, nationalistic newspapers would have had a big hand in sort of the Irish building their strength to bite back and to try and get some of their autonomy back. But what kind of impact would the circumstances and the fallout of the famine/genocide have had on, say, later revolutionary generations?
So I suppose it kind of encompasses everything that was happening at the time. So like even prior to the 1800s, you have rebellions happening, like the 1798 rebellion, really, really like well-known rebellion, particularly in the southeast, like Wexford, Carlow. So you had rebellions already kind of happening. And that's kind of what prompted the Act of Union, kind of like they kind of, you know, kind of stamped down on these rebellions and we'll bring peace to Ireland kind of thing. But then you have the portion of people that would have emigrated, particularly to North America, who would have settled, and they would have been coming in contact with not so much anti-Catholic, but anti-Irish sentiment. So you have the whole no blacks, no dogs, no Irish. So they would have really kind of cemented themselves in their own little communities, and there was a lot of nationalism. There was a lot of pride in being Irish, a lot of pride in Irish culture. There would have been a lot of that. And then for the people who stayed, in seeing evictions and seeing everything that went on, you have the Fenian Brotherhood, which did start in the US, but then you have things like the Land League over here, who were promoting boycotts of, and that's where boycott came from. Like we invented that. We invented boycotting. So it was boycotting rents, basically fighting bailiffs that were trying to throw people out and destroy people's homes, which, hello, can we see the echoes of that again today? You also have so the people that remained and survived would have seen all this happening, and there was a rise in nationalism. And then you have the Irish Republican Brotherhood, the Land League as well would have had a good portion of the Land League would have actually been Catholic priests as well. So you have that Catholic nationalism conglomerate that's like starting to really take hold, and the fight against landlords and that kind of thing. So that would have been within 50 years of, the establishment of the Irish Free State, really, like would have been within 40 years of the 1916 Rising. But what you then see is in that establishment of the Irish diaspora in the US, you have as I said, the Fenian Brotherhood, which then became the Irish Republican Brotherhood. You have the likes of De Valera, who is documented in going over, drumming up funds, getting arms and fundraising for the fight for basically the Irish Revolution. And then what you also see is maybe they went over when they were kids, the emigrants from the famine and their descendants who would have joined the US Army to naturalize and to get an American passport and to get that kind of security for themselves, taking their American Army trained selves back to Ireland during the Civil War. So there's a lot of interplay in all of this as well. And I'm being very I'm glossing over a lot of like nuance, but I can't possibly go into all the details. So
I know,
yeah.
I know, lifetimes, Amy, lifetimes and lifetimes to cover it all. But I suppose the question is then, why weren't there more revolutions happening whilst the famine was happening, in case it isn't sort of obvious for people?
So like you've this kind of just reminds you, like, why didn't we fight? Why haven't we fought against this government that came in during a global pandemic? Like, people were just wrecked.
Yeah.
Like they had no food, no food, they'd no strength. Even like there's been questions of, well, why didn't people go fishing? People didn't have strength. Like, they didn't have the strength to, or like, be able to go fishing. But you had things like I've already mentioned, like the assisted emigration. You can have this better life, or you can be poor and miserable here. There was also the threat of eviction. So again, like, this is all just, we could be talking about 2021, but we're not. We're talking about like the late 1800s. There's a threat of eviction.
Now's a good time to jump in and say as well, the visions that we've had from soup kitchens all over the country and school kids going to school hungry. This is a thing I've never known in my lifetime in Ireland. And we're meant to be sort of improving on how things used to be, and it actually seems like we're taking a massive nosedive backwards. And as you say, it's eerily similar to what's going on today. Our streets might be shinier, we might feel as though we have better infrastructure, but the people are hungry, and the people are bloody going without homes as well. So we're starting to, it's why aren't we fighting back now? Well, because we're too worried about where we're going to be living in 6 months' time. Some of us are very worried about where our next meal is coming from and that kind of thing. So I think that's a question you'll hear a lot when there's terrible circumstances being visited upon people. It'll be, oh, well, why didn't you do more? Why didn't you do more? Like, but that's not really how the nature of control goes. And I think that's really the fundamental similarity between then and now.
100%. And like, you're looking at like where the landlords were in charge and the ruling class was in charge. You look at who's in charge now and what percentage of TDs are landlords, and it's right. Like, that's the part I think that riles me more, is that, like, how have we not learned from our history? So yeah, that really, really frustrates me. I could go on rants about that, and I have gone on rants about that on TikTok, but I won't here.
Well, we are working our way back towards what's going on nowadays. But you're right to point out, the amount of the people in charge and the vested interest they have in keeping us poor in so many, many ways. They're literally financially benefiting from it. They're socially benefiting from it. Their jobs are much easier for them than they should be. I think one of the big differences is that back then, the people who were sitting on the top of the pyramid scheme, which is essentially what it was for land, they were afraid, that the people would eventually revolt. It was a constant worry for them. I think I think the people in Dáil Éireann have lost that fear. I think they've actually disconnected from the people they're meant to be serving so much that they're maybe not afraid of us anymore. And, I would never say that fear is a good thing, but at the same time, it does help to keep systems in check when you've got some very, very rich invested people sitting on the top of it,
100%. 100%. This is a quote from V for Vendetta. Government should be afraid of its people. Like we have, our votes are the power, and I think the last election last year really showed that. I don't think they were expecting what happened in the last election, and I think there's part of them that is maybe getting that fear back.
Yes.
But yeah, it's still it's so frustrating to kind of watch it play out and to watch the rhetoric.
I suppose, at least as well, one of the things we maybe can be a little bit thankful for is that I don't think religion is playing such a quite a big role in our circumstances these days. Obviously we're still cleaning up the fallout of the shenanigans they've been up to for a long time now, unchecked, which that's a whole other conversation. But back in the time of the famine, like that was sort of another kind of pillar in society that was, could be very used in ways to unite people, used in ways to divide people. Can you talk to us a little bit about the effect of religion on the famine and society at the time?
So, as I was saying previously, like with the penal laws, you really saw it with the penal laws and the discrimination between Catholic ownership, like the discrimination prohibition on Catholic ownership of land. And then I honestly think, like looking at it, it's as much of a classist kind of financial issue. It just so happens that most of those who were Protestant had more money.
Yeah, not all though. It wasn't clear cut.
No, and there are areas where you see kind of poor populations of Protestants who were in the same boat as the Catholics. So that like it's really, really not that clear cut. Like you look at now, I like I'm not an expert on this at all, but I have done a bit of research on it and looking at in Ulster. When you look at land ownership in Ulster and the divides there, and again, it is that kind of divide where you have the poorer classes who are less well off tended to be Catholic, and the land owning richer people tended to be Protestants, and that's kind of where it is. And as you were saying, like religion can be used to divide people and to unite people, and sometimes I do think that like the religious kind of thing is being pushed to further divide by some people. But yeah, it's kind of it in one sense it is really, really obvious when you look at it that there is this like divide between the two. It's an us, there is always an us and them, no matter kind of what you're looking at. There is a in-group, out-group kind of thing, and I think that's just human psychology. But yeah, it's not as quite as clear cut as everything is nuanced. Everything is always it depends kind of with everything. But for the most part,
there's a temptation there for people to want to boil it just down to religion.
Yeah, they want an easy answer.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And when it comes to this period in particular, there's no such thing. You don't get close to an easy answer on anything.
No, you don't. So that's so typically Irish as well. There are no straight answers with anything.
Yeah, that's true. It wouldn't be Irish if it was straightforward.
Yeah,
in fairness.
Exactly.
Can you explain to us, just before we come off kind of organized religion, about taking the soup? It's a term that people from outside Ireland might hear in our content, but they mightn't necessarily understand what it means.
Yeah, so taking the soup would have been, and it was primarily children. So when I was just to briefly go back to when I was saying in 1847, there was that British parliamentary decision to not give any aid. And then there was this kind of like Helen Lovejoy, will somebody think of the children kind of moment, where people were like, we need to feed the kids, like the kids need to be fed. So within these soup kitchens, there was a lot of soup kitchens that were set up by Protestant groups. And they set up schools and they fed starving kids. Now, just as we have hashtag not all landlords, but also hashtag not all Protestants, not every single soup kitchen did this, but some of them did. And essentially they were feeding the children, but also kind of indoctrinating them into Protestant-led schooling. And there was this kind of again, a choice between starvation or emigration. There was a choice between starvation or Protestantism.
Yeah, which would have been a very big consideration, probably up to a point, for Irish people, because, you know, any ties you might have had with Catholic friends and family at that point, if you took the soup, you know, it may well be perceived you were a turncoat, you were a betrayer to your community.
Yeah. Even on that point, like when you see people who were evicted, and then anyone who would have then opted to rent that house that someone was evicted from was called a land grabber, and they were shunned. You know, there was a lot of that. But on the opposite end of that, then you had people who were evicted, and like this comes back to the threat of eviction, where if, say, I was evicted and you took me in, Tara, you'd be under threat of eviction as well. So there was so you had neighbors shunning each other, either for land grabbing or for like not wanting to put themselves at risk. So yeah, there was a lot of hard choices that had to be made, and it was mainly about survival.
Since you are a witchy lady like myself, Amy, the Crafty Cailleach, which, you know, school children would probably just say to you means witch Cailleach. Yeah. Can you tell us, obviously we need to know about, it would be a thing sort of historians and academics might say to you, the belief in the supernatural would increase at times of hardship, of extreme poverty and that kind of thing. Can you talk to us about that?
So I haven't looked into the supernatural belief at the time, believe it or not, but there are certain things that I found that were really interesting. So there was a lot of cursing going on, as you can imagine, at the time. So I was actually going through the newspaper archives last week, and I was finding, like, specifically looking for really, you know, lighthearted articles about eviction. And one thing that was coming up was widows' curses. And you probably know, like, in the Irish tradition, a widow's curse is very, very powerful. So bailiffs coming, knocking on doors of widows, and they were cursing them at the door, laying down their life, I'll sacrifice myself and curse you. And so that was going on a lot. One thing I came across a few months ago was also to do with hearth magic, and the hearth being central to the home, but the hearth also being about prosperity and kind of the life of the hearth and home. Like, so there was a thing called cursing with the stones, where there's particular reference to this in Ulster, but when tenants would be evicted, they would fill the hearth up with stones to curse the next people that came and lived there, basically like taking away any chance of prosperity or whatever for these land grabbers. So those kind of things are things I've come across, mainly curses, which you know were very would have been quite popular. And then kind of looking at, not even necessarily looking at the supernatural belief at the time, but when I look at, no more is when I think about Ireland today and what's going on with leadership, when I look at like leadership throughout Irish history, and then you look back at the High Kings and the responsibility that they had in the lore with the relationship with the land and the right rulership, like right with the big R, of taking care of the land, making sure the people were looked after, making sure their rulings were just. And when that's not being done, it brings famine and disease and hardship.
Yeah. And
So
that, under the Brehon Law, that was meant to be a top-down system as well, where another thing that we're known worldwide for are our notions about hospitality would have come from that time too, where the sort of nobles of the land, the people who had the hads as opposed to the had nots, had to put up people who had not. The poor people essentially got to go up and ask for hospitality from the people who had money and had food and all of that. And you were obliged to look after these people because it was kind of what do they call it? Restorative justice. And it was making sure that nobody went without, actually, essentially was meant to be, in theory, the bottom line of it. And it's a terror how we have lost that. I mean, it would be very easy just to say to blame Britain and say they took it away from us. But well, apart from the fact that at certain times you could also say we were handing it away, but it's a terror how just our complete value system has changed so much, where money and commerce has usurped all of that, and seems to be what's running things now, like exclusively.
Yeah, and like there's very much a kind of now, like there is and there isn't. I think there's definitely a set of people, and I think my estimation, you would be in this group of people where there is that kind of trying to hold on to community and holding on to like decency and like bringing awareness to things and not kind of being in that individualist society. But I do think like capitalism just breeds that. It just breeds that kind of like think of yourself, and like a little bit of selfishness is not a bad thing. Like sometimes you do have to put yourself first, but at the same time, I definitely would agree with you. There's definitely that kind of move away from older traditions of hospitality, of charity, and very much. And again, I'm seeing this coming top down anyway. This kind of like, you can't ask for a handout. There's shame being put on people asking for a handout when that's what we should be doing. We should be taking care of everybody.
Yeah. A bit of a did we cover the emigration? Is there like anything else like the fallout of emigration for generations after us? Do you think that's something that's still affecting us today?
100%. 100%. I have so much to say on emigration. I just have so much to say on it.
Tell us, Amy, tell us it all.
So I've already talked about the North American emigration, and there was the anti-Irishness, but not so much anti-Catholic as much as there was in Australia. And I recently did, and someone actually asked me to do a YouTube video on it. And when I started looking into it, I actually had to put it down. As you were saying like earlier, like trying to go through Irish history, you just like, you have to put it down sometimes. Sometimes you're just not in the headspace for it.
It's heartbreaking.
It is. It really is. But I was asked to do this video on an Irish orphan immigration to Australia during the famine, famine orphans. And I looked into it, put it down, said no, not right now. And then lo and behold, 7 months later, it comes up in an essay for college. And I wrote this essay, and it was just heartbreaking. So essentially, because of the famine, there was a lot of orphans that ended up in workhouses, and Australia wouldn't have been a very popular destination because it would have been a much longer journey. It was a 3-month journey by ship. And also there was probably, now this is my inference on this, but I would imagine there was very much still a strong association with going to Australia being tied up with being a convict, which was another reason probably
that was a thing for a while.
That was under the penal laws as well. Like
people were sent there for punishment to do hard labor. It was essentially a death sentence.
But that was also an emerging British colony. So in the 1840s, commissioners, poor law commissioners started going around to poor laws and specific immigration commissioners, and they started picking out eligible young girls between the ages of 14 to 19, maybe 20, to ship off to Australia to work as domestic servants and to marry settlers. And what these girls faced, that they were promised, oh, you know, you'll get married, and we'll probably come back to it a little bit later, like women at the time, but marriage prospects weren't great because a lot of people had emigrated. So the promise of marriage and a better life and work and really good wages in Australia would have been very attractive, especially when you've lost pretty much your entire family. So these girls would have opted to go along. There was very much an incentive for the poor law commissioners to send them because they were moving on a problem. They didn't have to pay for them in the workhouses. They didn't have to pay to feed them. All they had to do was pay to get them to Plymouth in the UK and to dress them, put them on a ship to Plymouth, never see them again. And then off they went to Australia. And then when they got there, there was very much anti-Irish sentiment. And then because of the colonists there, because like America was a republic, the US was a republic, but Australia was a colony, and specific parts of Australia, so you have like New South Wales and Melbourne. So when they got there, there was a very much anti-Catholic sentiment. And oh no, these girls aren't up to snuff. They're not the standard we need. And all this kind of anti-Irish, like you're backward, you're illiterate, you can't read, all this stuff that we're very much used to hearing as in Irish stereotypes would have been there. And then you also had to harken back to British newspapers. This kind of caricature of Irish people was being portrayed in British comics and British newspapers at the time. But yeah, so that's a little bit of the Australian
and
emigration.
One that I hadn't actually heard on the stereotypes that was applied to people, and the kind of crap they had to put up with then when they actually took the big step and allowed themselves essentially to be shipped out like cattle, hoping for a better life. When they got over there, this was one that Dave actually turned my attention to that I hadn't heard of before. Have you heard of the potato with a moon, Amy? Did you come across that?
I have heard of it. Where
the Irish girls were getting an awful slag, and then when they went abroad and were working in houses because they were parboiling the potatoes.
Yeah, so they had the little circle on them.
Yes, and so that it would, you'd get the taste and the hit of the potato initially, but you'd be a lot longer digesting the raw core of it. So this was a trick they had picked up during famine times, that was hopefully they were trying to save their lives with it, that they'd be digesting this and getting nutrients out of it longer throughout the day. So, these poor girls then going over and thinking that's how you cook potatoes, which and getting a slagging for it too. It's just when you think about what they had to go through, and
that's not even the worst of it. I won't go into it, but the stuff I was reading last week was just horrible, absolutely horrible.
I read even as well about some of the things women had to do, the women who stayed and what they had to do to survive. I'm sure most of you watching can imagine what they were subjected to. Terrible things that YouTube doesn't like you talking openly about like that. Maybe
with too many content warnings. Too many content warnings.
Yes, exactly. But I mean, my next question was, were women disproportionately affected at the time? You've begun to answer that for us.
Yeah. So as you can imagine, no more, and you're still seeing the kind of social implications like this today. But you have, say you had your kind of typical Irish mammy who's trying to feed the family. And I think a lot of people will be able to relate to, your mammy will put her dinner out last and she'll probably have the smallest portion. That was still going on. So the kids were getting fed first, then the husband, because he was more than likely going out to do the hard labor to get the food or to get the money to pay the rent. So there was that. Then kind of you get on a little bit later. So that obviously had health impacts. There was also, I was reading, there's a lot of literature on women not being able to breastfeed at the time if they had infants, or they were a lot like less likely to lactate because they weren't getting the nutrition themselves to be able to produce milk. Then you have, when you look at later emigration, so the initial emigration would have been a lot of families, a lot of full families, parents, kids, even sometimes elderly relatives getting on the ships and hoping to make it to America. Later on, you see single people, and the majority of them would have been single women who would have had a trade, who would have maybe worked in textiles, would have had some kind of skills like that, or would have been kind of previously working in domestic kind of work, who would have been then looking for domestic work when they went over to North America. So there was a lot of that, and they were going over because subdivision of land had basically ceased in the later part of the 19th century. So you had most of the land inheritance going to the eldest son. You might have one or two go into the priests or go into the nuns, but even that came with a dowry, and I'll talk about that in a second if I don't go on too much of a tangent. But you had women leaving to go work in America or work wherever to make enough money to come back to have a dowry to then get married, because you had to get married with a dowry to marry well. And then, so that was one thing. Then you had the women that stayed would have been encouraged predominantly by the Catholic Church, because they would have been making money on marriage certs and administration, to marry. And they would have been marrying men who were much older. And then, as I said, I was talking about the poor girls that ended up going to Australia and what happened, some of what happened to them. But yeah, essentially, like the girls weren't getting inheritance. So they had to either work for a dowry or hope that their older brother, who was going to inherit the farm or the land, married really well, and then his wife's dowry was paying for one of his sisters to go get married. And then you had the women who would have gone into the nuns. And we're going to come back to the lovely Catholic Church here. So you have women going into the nuns, and I only found this out recently. I didn't know this until about 2 months ago, but women needed dowries to become a nun. So if you went into a convent without a dowry, you would have been a domestic worker, like a domestic servant in the convent. But to get the social power and the social status of being a nun, you had to give cash or cattle or land to the Catholic Church. And then you see the Catholic Church amass an amount of property in Ireland. And the knock-on effect you're seeing of that today is, because there's obviously a really high reduction in the amount of people going into the priests and the nuns, what I have seen is Catholic or church parishes that have this property now are either using it for charitable purposes or they're renting it on the private market. So
as well, for them still getting away with doing it.
Yeah.
Hopefully it's not for too much longer.
Hopefully not, no. But yeah, it's just like it really is just a little bit mind-blowing how much our history affects, and you can still see it today. Like you really can't, I don't think, touch anything in Irish culture and Irish society without seeing some of it in our history.
So something that I didn't mention at the top of the video, Amy, was that you actually have experience of working in real estate. So you have seen how property is actually working today. And just while we are on the topic of women being disproportionately affected, like, would you have experienced that in your experience, in your job in that area?
On one hand, not specifically, but when I think about it a bit more, it kind of ties into an unwillingness to engage with people on social welfare. So it's kind of an overlap of that, where you're seeing this unwillingness from some, again, hashtag not all landlords, but some landlords. And it's not uncommon for there to be an unwillingness to take people that are maybe in receipt of social welfare, rent allowance, the HAP scheme, the housing assistance payment scheme, which you're looking at like a specific subset of women which are maybe single mothers. Yeah. Now, I have seen in my own experience working in the industry an unwillingness to engage with that kind of tenant, but on the flip side, I have also worked with people who were more than willing to like agents that were willing to fight to house those tenants because they knew they were getting disproportionately affected. I think there's definitely a difference depending on who's in charge regarding gender with that.
Yeah. But a lot of it it's these days is like single parents, you know, male and female,
yeah,
are being badly affected. You know, I'm in a lot of renting groups on Facebook, and every day you're seeing messages from, you know, single parents and families. Sometimes it's couples together as well. It's basically everybody who isn't rich is at the minute seems to be at risk of sliding down that very, very slippery slope. These days in particular, you know, people outside of Ireland are probably experiencing their own version of it. It seems to be kind of global at the minute, or at least in the West. There seems to be an awful lot of it going on where, you know, housing prices are just ridiculous. Like homelessness is unprecedented. And it brings us on to, you know, why is that? And I suppose one of the things I've had experience with myself, and something that when I actually started digging into it a little bit, I sort of went, oh my God, what is this? What have we allowed to happen? So vulture funds, Amy, are they the new colonial oppressor?
I think so, or they definitely have the potential to be. I'm just going to adjust this because it's falling off my head. So I was looking into this recently as well. I found some CSO data that was showing, so like the vast majority at the moment of the landlord market, or the landlords who are in that private rental market, are individual landlords. But there's been particularly, I'm just going to actually look at this screen here because I have a little chart, which I will send on to you because it's really interesting. It was an RTE article, but it was giving the Central Statistics Office data. And there was a drop in landlords, in individual private landlords. And I'm just trying to find the thing here. There was also a very big jump between, I think it's 2017 and 2021, individual landlords under the age of 45 fell from 35% to just over 24%. But from 2019 to 2020, rental properties owned by companies and pension funds went from 20,000 to 30,000.
Yeah.
So you're seeing, and like it's probably gone up more in the last year as well. Like we're constantly hearing on the news about vulture funds taking over property holdings. Like I've seen it myself, like working in the industry, not even necessarily vulture funds, but the whole kind of investment landlord who are buying up a lot of cheaper housing. So like most people when they're starting out in the property ladder are they're looking for that starter home. They're looking for that home under 250,000, under 200,000, even under 150,000. And that's the kind of property that these investment landlords and investment funds are buying up because it's cheap. You're paying less property tax on it, and you're making a higher return then on rent, because you can essentially, when you buy a property, your landlord, like you're renting it for the first time as a landlord, so you can set the rent at a market rent. You're not really capped at that 4% cap with the Residential Tenancies Board. You're starting afresh. So, and that's why there's a lot of demand for vacant possession of houses as well. Because if you're selling your property with the tenant in situ, then their tenancy takes precedence over what the rent can be. But if you sell it vacant, then the rent can be whatever you want it to be as per the market value when you start renting it out. So I do think it's a huge problem. And again, kind of harking back to what our government are doing or not doing about it is another big issue. They're very slow to act on it. They kind of, I've seen quotes and I've read articles of them saying, oh no, we don't support this, but actions speak louder than words in a lot of cases.
Are they not changing laws to better facilitate them doing it? As far as I could make out, as I said to you earlier, Amy, I've had some experience with vulture funds. When my father passed away last year, there was a whole big thing I had to get involved in, and you know, I was preparing myself for a big row. I was actually, the legal advice I got from my solicitor was to walk away from the situation. I'm glad I didn't. In the end, there was, you know, a little bit something for myself and my sister to come away with. But the power that they have, and I think whilst we were actually sort of, I say fighting that, whilst we were working through that process, as far as I could make out, there were actually laws being changed at the time to better accommodate, you know, vulture funds, stacked in the favour of vulture funds as well, and making it easier for them to essentially put people out of their houses. And sure, oh, whatever, the council will take care of you, or you can just be homeless. It doesn't really matter to them because you know, they're not individuals. They're not even, I don't think, Irish companies. They're large multinational corporations coming in and basically competing with people like me, and even, you know, people that have much better jobs than I do and have families and savings and all kinds of things. And they're having to compete against these vulture funds. You know, who have the government seemingly working on their side and who have endless funds and endless legal resources, and I would say there's no way you're going to win. I don't want to discourage people from going up against them. You can win, and people do. I think Lay Litigation Ireland is one of the, or the Hub Ireland, they're both good places to find out information for, you know, sort of things you should be keeping an eye out for if you do find yourself going up against a vulture fund. But it's shocking. And we're talking about vulture funds, Amy, but I know I've heard several other terms of different kinds of funds that are also operating maybe under very slightly different principles. But it just seems as though, you know, it's like, is it like in the Matrix when there's like, you know, they're down in Zion and you've all these creature robots, a thick layer of them flying between you and housing security, and there's just no way. It's an impenetrable wall. At least that's how it seems. So really, every time I think, you know, somebody manages to secure housing for life for themselves and their family these days in Ireland, it's a bloody miracle. I don't know how they're doing it.
And it really is. It seems like every year, even every month, it just gets like further and further away as an option. Like I saw an article there, some economist had predicted that by 2023 to qualify for a mortgage, you'd need to be like both people, like as a couple, both people would need to be making 90 grand a year. And like, I'm sorry, like I've never even broken 30 grand a year. And I've been working like full time in various offices and call centers and whatever for like the last 10 years. And
just for context, with so many people in Ireland who aren't in full-time employment or who aren't able to be in full-time employment. And I think with social welfare for a single person, you're coming in less than 10 grand, I think, a year. So you know, you still have to get into that market, and because as we've looked at, it should be as simple as, well, yes, you have less money, but you're sorted for housing, but you're not anymore. You know, it's not a case of, oh, the people who can't afford a house will be provided for them. They just have to wait for a bit. It is not that anymore. You know, it is dog eat dog out there. And the reality is that unless you have unlimited cash, unlimited resources, you're extremely limited in what you can do, to the point of it being nearly impossible to secure housing for life
100%.
these days. And we'll again, we'll not even get into the emotional and generational trauma of that kind of being disconnected from your land and the rug being pulled out from under you constantly, which I'm sure is a feeling that many people know. But we're going to have to try and wrap it up now, Amy, because I know that people are just going to be watching, and we all need a cup of tea at this point, and maybe a bit of a cry. But on the last note, really, I mean, how much of this do you think, in your opinion, as a bit of a rebel witch, Amy, how much of this is capitalism's fault?
Like, I'd love to pin it all on capitalism. But I think it's not even capitalism as necessarily a system, but it's the allowance of our leaders to allow this system to be. Because like we all know how easy it is for them to write legislation to give extra protections to landlords and cuckoo funds. It's as easy for them to do the same legislation to protect tenants, to protect people in Ireland, to give relief, to do rent freezes. We've seen them do it during the pandemic. So I think, yes, 100% capitalism is definitely a big factor, but it's also, I think, an unwillingness, and without wanting to get super political, but it is an unwillingness on the part of politicians to actually put those protections in place and put proper systems in place to help people get housing security. So yeah, it's a bit of that.
Yeah. And I suppose when you've all of the leaders making these decisions elected into a system that is modelled off the British parliamentary system,
yep,
as opposed to, you know, our own, as I say, Brehon law may not have been perfect. And again, I haven't even scratched the surface of learning about it yet. It's another side mission of mine. But I have a very big gripe, is even if we put the best people we have in there, is the system actually inherently stacked against the people at the bottom? But that is a question for another day, Amy.
It is. It absolutely is.
On the other hand, you have done amazingly well at helping us to shine some light on some of these really, really difficult topics. Like it's really just what we needed, was for you to come in there and to tell us exactly how it is, Amy, and help us dispel some of the myths and maybe introduce some nuance to some topics that tend to, people, as you say, they're looking for an easy answer. They want to split it right down the middle. It was this or it was that. It was an awful lot of factors, and you really give us a great introduction to some of those today. So as I said, go over and check out Amy's channel, the Crafty Cailleach, link in the description. And yeah, thanks a million, Amy. Gora Mila Mahagav.
A fibre bit, Tara. Thanks so much for having me. And I'll send on some of the links to articles as well, for resources, for if people want to learn more about things I've touched on as well.
Lovely. Thank you so much. So hit subscribe for more fun and witchy adventures. I upload every Thursday and you're not going to want to miss it. Slán agus Bannacht, goodbye and good luck to you.